Chapter 3 Marxists at the Waldorf of Times. So I say, fascism or communism, I take the side of love, and I laugh at men's ideas. A nice in New York, 25th of March 1949, a dank and slushy Tuesday. Outside the Waldorf Astoria Hotel on Park Avenue and 50th Street, a small and desultory picket, mostly men in gray gabardine coats, formed a slow circle on the sidewalk. Inside the hotel, the pace was frantic. Unusually for this time of year, the hotel was full, and one booking in particular was proving to be a headache. From room 1042, a plush bridal suite on the 10th floor, the orders came thick and fast all day. A request for extra telephones to be installed was followed by a flurry of telegraph messages, dictated to the hotel's wire room. More table lamps were needed, more of everything was needed. Calls to room service issued like a constant cannonade. Hamburgers, salads, steaks, tartare, side orders, bottles of claret, bottles of beer, more buckets of ice, please. Not your average honeymooners. As waiters staggered into the suite, they were met with a strange scene. Telephone cords webbed across the room, and at the end of the tangle, callers were leaning animatedly into each receiver. Every available surface was occupied by a person or teetering piles of paper. The suite was heavy with cigarette smoke. 2 secretaries took dictation, and an assistant worked a mimeograph machine, which had been installed in the bathroom, its floor invisible beneath a mounting pile of inky paper. A perpetual flow of visitors weaved in and out of the clutter. Amidst this ballyhoo, some members of the party looked on nervously as the waiters balanced their huge trays on the edge of the bed and hovered for tips. Who was going to pick up the tab? Sidney Hook, the philosopher from New York University who had booked the suite, seemed unconcerned about the escalating costs of the enterprise. In the bridal suite with Hook were writer Mary McCarthy and her third husband, journalist Bowden Broadwater, the novelist Elizabeth Hardwick and her husband, the poet Robert Lowell, Nicholas Nabokov, journalist and critic Dwight MacDonald, Italian journalist and former Munzenberg ally Nicola Chiaramonte, Arthur Schlesinger, Partisan Review editors William Phillips and Philip Rov, Arnold Beischman, a labor reporter friendly with anti-communist union leaders, Mel Pitzel, another labor specialist, and David Dubinsky of the Ladies' Garment Workers Union. Despite his job description, Dubinsky seemed perfectly at ease in this chaotic little intellectual parliament. Downstairs, in the Waldorf Astoria ballroom, the hotel's already stretched staff were assisting with last-minute touches to a room dressed for a conference. Flowers were being arranged around a dais which formed a crescent across the far end of the room. Microphones were checked. 1, 2, 1, 2. A huge banner reading, Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, was lifted across the wall behind the speaker's platform. Already, some of the 1,000 delegates to the conference were arriving for the inaugural reception. The demonstrators outside were picking up, heckling guests as they walked through the swing doors into the lobby. "Softies," they shouted, as Lillian Hellman, Clifford Odets, Leonard Bernstein, and Dashiell Hammett arrived. Special scorn was reserved for the millionaire Ivy Leaguer, Corliss Lamont, who was acting as sponsor of the conference. Son of the chairman of J.P. Morgan & Co. Investment Bank, educated at Phillips Academy and Harvard, Lamont summoned up enough patrician reserve to ignore the insults flung at him by the angry picket. The protest had been organized by a right-wing alliance consisting of the American Legion and a group of Catholic and patriotic societies. Its complaint was that the conference, which was sponsored by the National Council of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions, was merely a front for the Soviets. That the commies were here, not, as they claimed, in the interests of goodwill and intellectual exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, but to propagandize America. And in effect, they were right. The conference was a common form initiative, a daring ploy to manipulate public opinion in America's own backyard. The Soviet Party, led by A.A. Faddeev, head of the Union of Soviet Writers, and including composer Dmitry Shostakovich, pride of their delegation, was also comfortably installed in rooms at the Waldorf. Its KGB nurses and party apparatchiks could congratulate themselves on this coup de théâtre. The demonstrators outside had a point. The Reds weren't just under the beds, they were in them. It was big news in the press that every entrance of the Waldorf Astoria would be blocked by a line of nuns praying for the souls of the participants, who had been deranged by satanic seduction, wrote Arthur Miller, who had accepted an invitation to chair one of the conference's debates. And on the morning of the conference, I actually had to step between two gentle sisters kneeling on the sidewalk as I made for the Waldorf door. Even then, it was a bewildering thing to contemplate, this world of symbolic gestures and utterances. Although they publicly dissociated themselves from the demonstration outside, the most dangerous thing we can do is to leave the task of exposing communist fronts to reactionaries. Sidney Hook and the Bridal Suite group were here for the same reason. Former Marxists and Trotskyists, they had once spun in the same communist orbit as the American intellectuals and artists who were, at this moment, arriving downstairs to attend the Soviet conference. Indeed, New York in the 1930s had once been described as the most interesting part of the Soviet Union. But the German-Russian Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 had produced a shock which had started New York City, bitter and demoralized, back from the USSR to America. Too, whilst Hook and his friends had been part of this movement away from Marxist radicalism towards the political center or right, other colleagues had yet to abandon their sympathy for communism. The Stalinists were still a very powerful gang, editor and critic Jason Epstein later claimed. They were like the political correctness lot now. There was good reason, therefore, to question the Stalinists' right to culture. The impressive turnout of fellow travelers at the Waldorf seemed to justify the fear of many American ideologues that communism's seductive spell was not broken, that the communist dream, despite Stalin's excesses, still lingered. For me, however, the conference was an effort to continue a good tradition that was presently menaced. Arthur Miller later wrote, "To be sure, the 4 years of our military alliance against the Axis powers were only a reprieve from a long-term hostility that had begun in 1917 with the revolution itself, and merely resumed when Hitler's armies were destroyed. But there was simply no question that without Soviet resistance, Nazism would have conquered all of Europe, as well as Britain, with the possibility of the U.S., being forced into a hands-off isolationism at best, or at worst, an initially awkward but finally comfortable deal with fascism, or so I thought. Thus, the sharp post-war turn against the Soviets and in favor of a Germany unpurged of Nazis not only seemed ignoble, but threatened another war that might indeed destroy Russia, but bring down our own democracy as well." For upstairs in the bridal suite, tempers were getting a little frayed. Ever since the decision had been taken, 3 weeks previously, to disrupt the conference, this inchoate group had been working relentlessly to develop an agitprop apparatus of its own. The enemy's preparatory activities were monitored, and the task of disrupting them was divided among the membership of a burgeoning ad hoc committee. An international counter committee was named and included Benedetti Croce, T.S. Eliot, Karl Jaspers, Andre Malraux, Jacques Maritain, Bertrand Russell, and Igor Stravinsky. Even the Nobel Prize winner Dr. Albert Schweitzer enlisted, apparently untroubled that his name also appeared in the enemy camp as one of the sponsors of the Waldorf Conference. Taking advantage of their Trojan horse position within the Waldorf, the group intercepted mail addressed to the conference's organizers and sabotaged their attempts to win over the press by doctoring official statements and releases. It issued a volley of press releases challenging speakers and sponsors of the conference to identify themselves as the Communist Party members or inveterate fellow travelers that they are. For those whose consciences failed to be pricked, Hook and his cohorts speeded the process by publicly disclosing the true connections of the leaders of the Waldorf meeting. Thus, F.O. Matheson's membership of a host of Communist Front organizations, including the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, was revealed in a press release. Howard Fast was listed as author of propaganda novels, and Clifford Odets was exposed, in less than scientific manner, as another Communist Party member according to testimony of a former staff member of the Daily Worker. As the opening ceremonies of the conference drew near, ideas about how best to subvert the proceedings differed wildly, as do later accounts of the affair. Hook, the self-appointed field marshal of the little anti-communist suite, briefed his compagnons de guerre on how to survive a forced expulsion from the hall. Armed with umbrellas, they were to bang the floor to get attention and then tie themselves to their chairs. Thus anchored, their removal from the hall would be delayed. If they were prevented from delivering their speeches, mimeographed copies would be distributed to reporters by Hook's sidekicks, Bachman and Pitzela. As it happened, these guerrilla strategies were never called into play, although, for good measure, umbrellas were banged on the floor. To their surprise, the subverters were each given 2 minutes to speak, though they had to wait for the first speaker, a retired bishop from Utah, to finish his endless peroration. Mary McCarthy reserved her question for the brilliant Harvard scholar F.O. Matthiessen, author of The American Renaissance, who had described Ralph Waldo Emerson as an ancestor of American communism. Did Matthiessen think Emerson would be allowed to live and write in the Soviet Union? She asked. Matthiessen conceded he would not, and then added, in what was deemed the non sequitur of the year, that Lenin wouldn't be permitted to live in the United States either. When Dwight MacDonald asked Fadeev why he had accepted the Politburo's critical suggestions and rewritten his novel The Young Guard, Fadeev replied, "The Politburo's criticism helped my work greatly." Nicholas Nabokov decided to attend a panel where Shostakovich was one of the speakers. Among the musicians on the platform were people known to Nabokov, friends even. He waved to them, and they smiled nervously in response. After a typically dull and predictable session, Nabokov was finally given the floor. On such and such a date in number X of Pravda appeared an unsigned article that had all the looks of an editorial. It concerned 3 Western composers, Paul Hindemith, Arnold Schoenberg, and Igor Stravinsky. In this article, they were branded, all 3 of them, as obscurantists, decadent bourgeois formalists, and lackeys of imperialist capitalism. The performance of their music should therefore be prohibited in the USSR. Does Mr. Shostakovich personally agree with this official view as printed in Pravda? Provocatio, provocation, cried the Russian stooges, as Shostakovich received whispered instructions from his KGB nurse. The composer then stood up, was handed a microphone, and his ashen face turned down to study the floorboards, murmured in Russian, "I fully agree with the statements made in Pravda." It was an appalling episode. Rumors that Shostakovich had been ordered to attend the conference by Stalin himself had reached this New York gathering. He was the sacrificial lamb, appearing, said one observer, pale, slight, and sensitive-looking, hunched over, tense, withdrawn, unsmiling, a tragic and heart-rending figure. Arthur Miller described him as small, frail, and myopic, standing as stiffly erect as a doll. Any display of independent spirit on his part was a life-or-death matter. Nicholas Nabokov, on the other hand, was a white Russian émigré who had become an American citizen in 1939. He was safe. Nabokov was throwing punches at a man whose arms were tied behind his back. As chairman of the arts panel at which this confrontation took place, Arthur Miller was appalled. "It is the memory of Shostakovich that still haunts my mind when I think of that day. What a masquerade it all was! God knows what he was thinking in that room, what splits ran across his spirit, what urge to cry out, and what self-control to suppress his outcry, lest he lend comfort to America and her new belligerence toward his country, the very one that was making his life a hell." 30 years later, Shostakovich's memoirs appeared in the West, giving his account of the Waldorf affair. "I still recall with horror my first trip to the USA. I wouldn't have gone at all if it hadn't been for intense pressure from administrative figures of all ranks and colors, from Stalin down. People sometimes say it must have been an interesting trip. Look at the way I'm smiling in the photographs. That was the smile of a condemned man. I felt like a dead man. I answered all the idiotic questions in a daze and thought, when I get back, it's over for me. Stalin liked leading Americans by the nose that way. He would show them a man, here he is, alive and well, and then kill him. Well, why say led by the nose? That's too strongly put. He only fooled those who wanted to be fooled. The Americans don't give a damn about us, and in order to live and sleep soundly, they'll believe anything." 7. The conference continued for several days. T.S. Eliot sent a telegram opposing the conference. Another telegram came from John Dos Passes, who urged American liberals to expose Soviet tyranny so that without exposure, despotism will perish from its own poison. Thomas Mann, who once commented that anti-communism is the basic stupidity of the 20th century, sent a cable in support of the conference. The debates were ritualistic and deadly dull, spiced up only by the intervention of a young Norman Mailer, described by one contemporary as a preppy Frank Sinatra, who surprised both sides when he accused both the Soviet Union and the United States of aggressive foreign policy programs that minimized the chance of peaceful coexistence. So long as there is capitalism, there is going to be war. Until you have a decent, equitable socialism, you can't have peace, he said, before concluding that all a writer can do is tell the truth as he sees it, and to keep on writing. 8 Mailer's speech had the magic effect of uniting antagonists in a chorus of boos. By now, the picket outside had swelled to over 1,000, bristling with placards. One observer wondered how it was that so many noisy, tough plug uglies are at the disposal of the extreme right. Hooke was astute enough to observe that the communism inside the Waldorf and the kind of militant anti-communism outside on the sidewalk were feeding off each other. His aggressive PR campaign, run by Mel Pitzel, was now beginning to bite. The newspaper magnate and paranoid anti-communist William Randolph Hearst ordered all his editors to follow the beat of Hooke's drum and denounce the commie conference and its American fellow travelers. In April, Henry Luce, owner-editor of the Time Life Empire, personally oversaw a 2-page spread in Life magazine, which attacked the degradations of the Kremlin and its American dupes. Featuring 50 passport-sized photographs, the piece was an ad hominem attack which prefigured Senator McCarthy's unofficial blacklists. Dorothy Parker, Norman Mailer, Leonard Bernstein, Lillian Hellman, Aaron Copland, Langston Hughes, Clifford Odets, Arthur Miller, Albert Einstein, Charlie Chaplin, Frank Lloyd Wright, Marlon Brando, Henry Wallace, all were accused of toying with communism. This was the same Life magazine which in 1943 had devoted an entire issue to the USSR, featuring Stalin on the cover, and praising the Russian people and the Red Army. It was dangerous to participate in that fateful attempt to rescue the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union in the face of the mounting pressures of the Cold War, and one knew it at the time, remembered Arthur Miller. The air was growing hot with belligerents. There was no denying the probability of retribution against the conference participants as its opening day drew near. And indeed, as the months passed, supporter of the Waldorf Conference, or participant, would become an important key to the subject's disloyalty. That a meeting of writers and artists could generate such widespread public suspicion and anger was something brand new in the post-war world. 9, it certainly was dangerous. Those who were outed at the Waldorf, a hotel famous for its pre-war debutante coming-out balls, were now the subject of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's interest. His Federal Bureau of Investigation sent agents to cover the conference and report back on the delegates. Back at FBI headquarters, a file was opened on the young Norman Mailer. Files on Langston Hughes, Arthur Miller, F.O. Mathieson, Lillian Hellman, Dashiell Hammett, and Dorothy Parker, who was listed variously as an undercover communist, an open communist, and a communist appeaser, had already been opened in the 1930s, but their new acts of perversion were now recorded. In some cases, the FBI did more than monitor the Waldorf communists. Shortly after the conference, an FBI agent paid a visit to the publishing firm of Little Brown and told them that J. Edgar Hoover did not want to see Howard Fast's new novel Spartacus on the bookshelves 10. Little Brown returned the manuscript to its author, who was then rejected by 7 other publishers. Alfred Knopf sent the manuscript back unopened, saying he wouldn't even look at the work of a traitor. The book finally came out in 1950, published by Howard Fast himself. The Stalinists' right to culture was certainly under attack. With coverage in Life magazine, the strange pas de deux between communists and former communists at the Waldorf had now become a major public spectacle. Hooke congratulated himself for having choreographed the best scenes. We had frustrated one of the most ambitious undertakings of the Kremlin. Sidney Hooke was born in December 1902 in New York's Williamsburg, a Brooklyn slum of unrivaled poverty in those years. This was fertile ground for communism, to which Hooke became a young adherent. Short in stature, his small face framed by round spectacles, Hook looked like a Cracker Barrel sage. But he was fiercely intellectual, a cerebral brawler always ready to jump into the fight. Attracted to the muscular, bruising posturing of New Yorkist communism, he moved easily between its various factions, from Stalinism to Trotskyism to Bukharinism. He helped prepare the first translation of Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism for the American Communist Party. He worked for a spell in the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, and he published a series of articles on Marxism, the most famous of which, Why I Am a Communist, provoked a Hearst-led campaign to have him dismissed from New York University. In the pattern of many New York intellectuals, Hook's faith in communism began to weaken after a succession of betrayals. The 1936-7 treason trial of Leon Trotsky, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, and a series of disastrous errors of judgment, theory, and policy by Stalin. A public enemy of the Communist Party, he was denounced as a counter-revolutionary reptile, his supporters dismissed as hookworms. By 1942, Hook was informing on the writer and editor Malcolm Cowley to the FBI. Hook the revolutionary from Williamsburg had become Hook the darling of the conservatives, Spot 11. In the late afternoon of Thursday, 27th of March 1949, police roped off a block on 40th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. From the balcony of the aptly named Freedom House, Hook and his private army waved triumphantly at a dense crowd gathered below in Bryant Square. His team of promoters had done a splendid publicity job, said Nabokov, who was particularly well-suited to basking in the limelight. Nabokov used this end-of-conference party to deliver a speech about the plight of composers in the Soviet Union and the tyranny of the party's kulturapparat. Addressing a packed audience in the hall of Freedom House, Nabokov deplored the use that was being made of Dmitri Shostakovich at the peace conference. Thunderous applause. And then Nabokov saw a familiar face rise from the back row of the hall and come at me. It was an acquaintance of mine from Berlin who, like me, had worked for OMGUS. He congratulated me warmly. "This is a splendid affair you and your friends have organized," he said. "We should have something like this in Berlin." The friend who stepped forward was Michael Josselson. His presence at the Waldorf Astoria conference and subsequently at the Freedom House rally was anything but the innocent coincidence Nabokov suggests. Josselson was there at the express instructions of his boss, Frank Wisner, the CIA's covert action wizard. This splendid affair was being subsidized by Wisner's outfit, and Josselson was there to keep an eye on the investment. With the witting collaboration of David Dubinsky, whose presence in the bridal suite was always something of a mystery, the CIA had procured Hook's stronghold in the Waldorf. Dubinsky had threatened to have the unions close down the hotel if the management could not accommodate his intellectual friends. Paid the bills, Nabokov received a large wudge of CIA dollars from Dubinsky to take back to the bridal suite and secured wide and sympathetic press coverage. Melvin Lasky, too, had come from Berlin to see how Hook's agitprop activities were shaping up. The two had liaised the previous year when Hook had been in Berlin as an educational advisor in the American Zone. Lasky thrilled to the confrontational character of the Waldorf Conference, reserving special scorn for Shostakovich. His timidity was extreme, he later claimed. He didn't want to stand up for anything. But there are those who say, "There are things that are bigger than you, Shostakovich, bigger even than your music, and you have to pay an entrance fee, whether you like it or not, in the name of a higher purpose." 13 Hook and his friends at the Waldorf felt they had paid their entrance fee. But most of them were not party to the hidden arrangement that had made their counteraction possible. Nicola Chiaramonte was suspicious of Hook's contacts. He warned Mary McCarthy, somewhat cryptically, to hold out against Hook and his lieutenants, whose many press releases in this hectic week had included statements explicitly supporting U.S. foreign policy. What the boys in Hook do in the last analysis is not to say they are happy about the State Department, but that finally they are prepared to yield to American raison d'etat as against the Russians. This, continued Chiaramonte, was a preordained act of conformism and a very unconstructive one from precisely the democratic point of view. 14. This early sensitivity is very revealing, worthy of a man whose perceptions had been refined by his work as a political agent for the Munzenberg Trust. For, although Chiaramonte didn't know it yet, he had come very close to the truth. A little bit closer, and he would have discovered that it wasn't just the State Department that had taken an interest in Hooke, but America's spying establishment. Miller intuited that the Waldorf Conference would turn out to be a hairpin curve on the road of history. 40 years later, he wrote, "Even now, something dark and frightening shadows the memory of that meeting, where people sat as in a Saul Steinberg drawing, each of them with a balloon overhead containing absolutely indecipherable scribbles. There we were, a room full of talented people and a few real geniuses, and in retrospect, neither side was wholly right, neither the apologists for the Soviets nor the outraged red haters. To put it simply, politics is choices, and not infrequently, there really aren't any to make. The chessboard allows no space for a move." 15. But for the CIA, the Waldorf Conference represented a chance to make some new moves in the great game. It was a catalytic event, recalled CIA agent Donald Jameson. It was the tip-off that there was a massive campaign launched in the West on an ideological assertion of influence at a political level. It delivered a powerful message to those in government who understood that the compelling nature of the communist delusion was not going to be dissipated by conventional methods. We now understood that it was necessary to do something about it, not in terms of suppressing these people, many of whom, of course, were very noble types, but rather as part of a general program looking toward, ultimately, what we now can call the end of the Cold War. 16.